Picture this: the ground beneath you starts to tremble, gently at first, then with a force so violent it feels like the world is tearing itself apart. Walls crack, towers collapse, and in mere moments, everything you've ever known is reduced to rubble. This isn't just a scene from a disaster movie. It's a reality that has played out countless times throughout human history. Earthquakes aren't just natural phenomena, they're silent architects of destiny, reshaping civilizations in ways we're only beginning to understand. Today, we're diving into the stories of the most catastrophic earthquakes that didn't just shake the earth. They shook the very foundations of human society, altering the course of empires, cultures, and even the way we see our place in the world. Think about the myths and legends passed down through generations, stories of gods punishing humanity or the ground swallowing cities whole. These tales aren't just flights of fancy. They're often rooted in real, seismic events that left such deep scars they became etched into our collective memory. From the ruins of ancient Pompeii to the lost cities of the Indus Valley, earthquakes have acted as invisible hands, guiding the rise and fall of some of history's greatest civilizations. But what if these disasters did more than just destroy? What if they also forced humanity to adapt, innovate, and rebuild in ways that shaped the modern world? This journey isn't just about the science of tectonic plates or the raw power of nature. It's about the human spirit. It's about how societies picked up the pieces after unimaginable devastation, how cultures interpreted these events through religion and art, and how the echoes of these earthquakes still resonate today. We'll uncover archaeological discoveries that rewrite history books, explore ancient texts that hint at long-forgotten catastrophes, and even see how some civilizations used these disasters as a catalyst for rebirth. So buckle up, because by the end of this video, you'll never look at the ground beneath your feet the same way again. The earth may seem solid, but its history is anything but stable. And the stories it has to tell, they're nothing short of extraordinary. To truly grasp how earthquakes have shaped civilizations, we first need to peel back the layers of the earth itself, literally. Picture the planet's crust not as a solid shell, but as a jigsaw puzzle of massive slabs called tectonic plates, constantly shifting, colliding, and grinding against one another. These plates move at about the same speed your fingernails grow, slow by human standards, but over centuries, that movement builds up immense pressure. When that pressure finally snaps, the result is an earthquake, sending shock waves radiating outward like ripples from a stone dropped in water. But tectonic plates aren't the only culprits. Volcanic activity can trigger quakes too, as magma forces its way through the Earth's crust, fracturing rock in its path. Even human actions play a role. Mining, drilling, or filling reservoirs behind massive dams can destabilize the ground, creating what scientists call induced seismicity. What all these causes share is the sudden release of energy, transforming the Earth from a silent foundation into a violent force. Ancient civilizations had no way of measuring seismic waves or mapping fault lines. When the ground shook, they saw it as the wrath of gods or omens of doom. The Greeks blamed Poseidon, the earth shaker, while the Japanese spoke of a giant catfish trapped beneath the land, thrashing to escape. These myths weren't just stories, they were attempts to explain the unexplainable, to make sense of disasters that could erase cities in minutes. Today, we have seismographs tracing every tremor and satellites tracking plate movements millimeter by millimeter. We know earthquakes aren't punishments, they're the planet's natural language, whispers of its inner workings turned into roars. Yet despite our advances, the raw power of a major quake still humbles us. And that's what makes their historical impact so profound. When the Earth moves, civilizations don't just rebuild, they adapt, reinvent, and sometimes vanish entirely, leaving behind clues for us to decipher. The science is just the beginning. The real story lies in how humanity responds when the ground beneath its feet refuses to stay still. Long before modern seismographs or even the concept of tectonic plates, the earliest earthquake ever recorded shook the Shandong province of China around 1831 BCE. Etched onto oracle bones, animal bones, or turtle shells used for divination, this ancient account reveals how early civilizations grappled with the terrifying unpredictability of seismic disasters. Imagine a scribe carefully carving characters into bone, documenting rivers suddenly reversing their flow and mountains crumbling into valleys. These weren't just dry observations, they were attempts to make sense of a world that could literally turn upside down without warning. What makes this record so remarkable isn't just its age, it's the way it blends stark reality with mythic interpretation. To the Shang dynasty people, earthquakes weren't mere geological events. They were messages from the gods, cosmic punishments or warnings carved into the earth itself. The oracle bones often paired descriptions of quakes with divinations, as if trying to decode the heavens' intentions. One bone fragment even questions whether the quake was caused by the displeasure of ancestral spirits, showing how deeply these disasters were woven into spiritual life. But beyond the supernatural explanations, these ancient records hold startlingly accurate details. Accounts describe entire villages vanishing into fissures, dust clouds blotting out the sun for days, and the eerie silence that followed, the chaos details that modern seismologists recognize as hallmarks of major quakes. The Shandong event likely measured around 7 on the Richter scale, strong enough to flatten cities built without anti-seismic technology. Yet from this devastation came humanity's first steps toward understanding earthquakes, not just as acts of gods, but as natural phenomena worth documenting. This seismic event did more than fracture the earth, it fractured old ways of thinking. In the aftermath, Chinese scholars began compiling observations into bamboo scrolls, noting patterns like foreshocks and aftershocks. Emperors ordered officials to record tremors across the kingdom, creating the world's first seismic monitoring system centuries before similar efforts in Greece or Persia. The quake became a turning point, shifting earthquakes from supernatural omens to subjects of study. Even the legendary Chinese philosopher Confucius later referenced these early records, using them to argue for a more rational understanding of nature's forces. The Shandong earthquake's legacy echoes far beyond ancient China. It set a precedent for how civilizations would document disasters, blending empirical observation with cultural narratives. Those oracle bones are more than historical curiosities, they're proof that even in the face of unimaginable destruction, humanity's impulse isn't just to rebuild, but to learn. Every modern seismograph, every earthquake-resistant skyscraper, owes a quiet debt to those first carvings on bone, where myth and science began their long dance toward understanding the ground beneath our feet. The island of Thera, now known as Santorini, was once the beating heart of the Minoan civilization, a sophisticated society with sprawling palaces, vibrant art, and advanced seafaring technology. Then, around 1600 BCE, the Earth roared to life in one of history's most catastrophic volcanic eruptions. The ground split open with such ferocity that the island itself was torn apart, sending towering tsunamis racing across the Aegean Sea toward Crete, the Minoan capital. The eruption was so powerful it dwarfed even the infamous Krakatoa event of 1883, ejecting enough ash and pumice to darken skies across the Mediterranean for years. What made this disaster so devastating wasn't just the eruption itself, but the chain reaction it set off. The collapse of Thera's volcanic cone triggered tsunamis with waves estimated at over 150 feet tall, enough to obliterate coastal cities in minutes. On Crete, nearly 70 miles away, Minoan ports were swallowed by the sea, their grand ships reduced to splinters. The ashfall poisoned crops, choked livestock, and left survivors gasping for air under a sulfurous haze. The Minoans, once the dominant power of the Bronze Age, found their trade networks shattered, their economy crippled, and their people scattered. Archaeologists have spent decades piecing together the aftermath. At the Minoan site of Akrotiri on Thera, excavations reveal a city frozen in time, frescoes still bright, pottery stacked as if waiting for owners who never returned. Unlike Pompeii, there are few human remains, suggesting many escaped the initial earthquakes that preceded the eruption. But Crete tells a darker story. Palaces like Knossos show signs of violent destruction, not just from tsunamis but from fires that raged unchecked in the chaos. The Minoans, masters of the sea, had no defense against the sea itself turning against them. This catastrophe didn't just weaken the Minoans, it created a power vacuum. Enter the Mycenaeans, a warlike culture from mainland Greece. With the Minoan fleet in ruins, the Mycenaeans seized control of trade routes, adopting and adapting Minoan art, writing, and architecture. Within centuries, their influence eclipsed the fading Minoans, reshaping the cultural landscape of the ancient world. Some scholars argue the eruption didn't just change history, it may have inspired one of humanity's most enduring legends, Atlantis. Plato's description of a wealthy island kingdom vanishing beneath the waves in a single day and night of misfortune bears eerie parallels to Thera's fate. Yet the true legacy of the Minoan eruption isn't just in ruins or myth, sits in the fragile line between civilization and catastrophe. The Minoans had no warning, no way to predict the fury beneath their feet. Today, Santorini's caldera is a tourist destination, its whitewashed villages perched precariously on the rim of the same volcano that once rewrote history. It's a stark reminder that the ground we build on is never as solid as it seems. In the summer of 464 BCE, the ground beneath Sparta convulsed with a violence that would shake more than just buildings. It would shake the very foundations of Spartan dominance. The quake struck at dawn when Spartan warriors were training in their barracks and the enslaved Helot population labored in the fields. Stone walls crumbled like sandcastles, crushing entire families beneath their weight. Ancient historians like Thucydides described fissures splitting the earth open, swallowing homes whole. Within moments, Sparta lost nearly 20,000 citizens, a catastrophic blow for a society that prized military strength above all else. But the disaster didn't end with the tremors. The quake exposed a fatal flaw in Sparta's rigid system, its reliance on the oppressed Helots, who outnumbered Spartan citizens nearly 10-1. With the city in ruins and its warriors distracted by rescue efforts, the Helots saw an opportunity. They launched the largest slave revolt in Spartan history, burning what remained of the city's outskirts and waging guerrilla warfare from the surrounding mountains. Sparta, famed for its invincible army, suddenly found itself fighting for survival on two fronts against the chaos of nature and the fury of those it had enslaved. This crisis forced Sparta to make unthinkable compromises. Desperate for reinforcements, they reached out to their longtime rival, Athens, for help. The Athenian general Cimon arrived with troops, but the alliance quickly soured. Spartan leaders, paranoid that Athenian ideas of democracy might infect their rigid society, abruptly sent them home. The insult deepened the rift between the two city-states, planting seeds for the Peloponnesian War that would erupt decades later. Meanwhile, the Helot revolt dragged on for years, draining Sparta's resources and forcing them to redesign their military tactics. The quake hadn't just toppled buildings, it had cracked the illusion of Spartan invincibility. Historians often point to this moment as a turning point in Greek history. Sparta's obsession with military perfection had left its society brittle, unable to adapt when nature refused to play by its rules. In the aftermath, Spartan leaders tightened control over the Helots with brutal crackdowns, but the damage was done. Other Greek city-states, particularly Athens, seized the chance to expand their influence while Sparta struggled to recover. The balance of power in ancient Greece had shifted not through battle or diplomacy, but because the earth itself had intervened. What makes the Sparta earthquake so fascinating isn't just the scale of destruction, but the way it reveals how even the most disciplined societies are at the mercy of natural forces. Sparta's story is a stark reminder that no amount of human planning can outmatch the raw power of the planet. The quake didn't just change Sparta, it rewrote the rules of an entire civilization, proving that sometimes history's most pivotal moments aren't made by kings or armies, but by the ground beneath our feet. The city of Antioch was the jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire, a bustling metropolis where silk-clad merchants haggled in markets filled with spices from India, where scholars debated philosophy in marble-columned halls, and where some of Christianity's earliest congregations had flourished. Then, in May of 526 CE, the earth unleashed a fury that would etch Antioch's name into history for all the wrong reasons. The quake struck at night, when most of the city's 250,000 residents were asleep, unaware that the very ground beneath them was about to become their tomb. Witnesses described a sound like thunder rolling underground before buildings began dancing on their foundations. Homes collapsed like houses of cards, burying families alive. The Grand Cathedral, one of Christendom's largest, crumbled during Pentecost celebrations, killing hundreds who had gathered for prayer. Fires erupted across the city, fed by overturned oil lamps, and the glow could reportedly be seen from ships miles out at sea. But the horror didn't end with the shaking. The Orontes River, swollen by spring rains, burst its banks, flooding shattered neighborhoods with churning mud. By dawn, Antioch was a graveyard. The death toll was staggering, an estimated 250,000 lives lost, making it one of the deadliest earthquakes in recorded history. Survivors faced unimaginable choices. A Byzantine historian wrote of parents digging through rubble with bare hands, only to abandon their search when the stench of decay became unbearable. Emperor Justinian, ruling from Constantinople, ordered immediate aid, sending gold and grain, but the scale of devastation overwhelmed even the empire's resources. Antioch's destruction sent shockwaves far beyond its ruins. As a key religious and economic hub, its decline weakened the Byzantine Empire's eastern flank, just as tensions with Persia were escalating. Trade routes shifted away from the crippled city, draining wealth from the region. The quake also struck a psychological blow. If God would allow such suffering in a center of early Christianity, what did that mean for the faithful? Some theologians pointed to Antioch's reputation for vice, framing the disaster as divine judgment, while others struggled to reconcile the tragedy with their beliefs. Archaeological evidence reveals a haunting detail. Many rebuilt structures were smaller, shoddier, as if the survivors had lost not just their homes but their confidence in permanence. Though Justinian rebuilt Antioch's walls and renamed it Theopolis, City of God, it never regained its former glory. Within a century, Persian armies would sack the weakened city, and later Muslim conquest sealed its fate as a shadow of its old self. The Antioch earthquake wasn't just a tragedy, it was a pivot point, proving that even the mightiest empires could be undone not just by armies or time, but by the earth's unrest. Its ruins whisper a timeless warning. Civilizations may rise, but the ground beneath them never promises to stay still. The morning of January 23, 1556, dawned like any other in China's Shongsi province, farmers tending winter wheat, scholars practicing calligraphy, merchants preparing goods for the Lunar New Year festivities. Then, without warning, the earth convulsed with such violence that entire mountains were said to have walked. The Shongsi earthquake, estimated at a magnitude 8 or higher, didn't just shake the ground, it rewrote the landscape. Rivers changed course, valleys became hills, and over 90 counties were reduced to rubble in less than 10 minutes. But the true horror lay in the human toll. An unimaginable 830,000 lives lost, making it the deadliest seismic event in recorded history. Ming Dynasty chronicles paint harrowing scenes of entire families crushed beneath collapsing cave dwellings, a common housing style in the lowest plateau region. The porous yellow soil, perfect for carving out homes, became a death trap when the quake struck. One survivor's account describes watching his village swallow itself as fissures opened and closed like monstrous jaws, entombing neighbors alive. The aftershocks continued for months, each tremor deepening the trauma of survivors who slept in open fields, terrified of being buried under collapsing structures. Yet from this devastation emerged something extraordinary: humanity's resilience. The disaster spurred innovations that would shape architecture for centuries. Builders observed that wooden pagodas often survived while stone towers crumbled, leading to new techniques like flexible joinery and interlocking brackets that allowed structures to sway rather than snap. The famous Yingxian wooden pagoda, built just years before the quake, stood unscathed. Its design principles became a blueprint for earthquake-resistant construction. Ming officials compiled meticulous records of damage patterns, creating some of history's first seismic safety guidelines. The psychological impact ran just as deep. The quake occurred during Emperor Jiajing's reign, a ruler obsessed with Taoist immortality. When nature demonstrated its absolute power, it shook not just the land but the imperial court's confidence. The disaster fueled philosophical debates about humanity's place in the cosmos, inspiring poets and painters to capture the fragility of human endeavors against nature's might. What makes the Shongsi earthquake so pivotal isn't just its body count, it's how it transformed disaster response. The Ming government organized mass relocations, established emergency granaries, and even implemented tax relief for survivors, early precedents for modern humanitarian aid. For the first time, an entire civilization was forced to confront seismic risk not as divine punishment, but as a permanent challenge to be outsmarted. The echoes of 1556 still resonate today, from Tokyo's skyscrapers to California's building codes, proving that even history's darkest tremors can leave behind light. On the morning of All Saints' Day in 1755, Lisbon stood as one of Europe's wealthiest cities, a thriving port where gold from Brazil funded Baroque churches and grand plazas. Then at 9:40 a.m., the first tremor struck. Within minutes, 3 violent shocks rippled through the city, toppling cathedrals where worshippers had gathered for Mass. Stone facades crumbled into the streets, burying thousands alive, but the horror was just beginning. As survivors fled toward the open docks, the sea suddenly retreated, revealing abandoned ships and glittering fish flopping on exposed mud. Then a wall of water 30 feet high came roaring back, swallowing the waterfront whole. The disaster didn't stop with the quake and tsunami. Fires erupted across the city, fueled by overturned candles from altars and kitchens. Flames raged for 5 days, reducing priceless libraries, palaces, and artworks to ashes. Contemporary accounts describe a hellish scene, priests clutching crucifixes as they burned. parents throwing children from collapsing windows and looters cutting fingers off corpses to steal rings in the chaos. When the dust settled, 60,000 were dead and 85% of Lisbon's buildings lay in ruins. But the earthquake's true impact wasn't just measured in rubble. It struck at the heart of the Enlightenment, forcing Europe's greatest minds to confront an unsettling question. How could a benevolent God allow such indiscriminate suffering? Philosopher Voltaire seized on the disaster, penning his famous poem on the Lisbon disaster, mocking the idea that divine justice was at work. Was Lisbon then more wicked than Paris? He asked, pointing out that brothels survived while churches collapsed. His writings, along with Rousseau's counterarguments, turned Lisbon into a battleground of ideas, one where nature's randomness challenged centuries of religious dogma. The quake also changed how societies responded to disasters. Portugal's Prime Minister, the Marquis of Pombal, took swift action, ordering soldiers to prevent looters and engineers to survey the damage. His now famous command, "Bury the dead and feed the living," marked a shift from passive resignation to proactive recovery. Architects pioneered earthquake-resistant designs, using flexible wooden frameworks known as gaiola pombalina, still visible in Lisbon's rebuilt downtown today. Lisbon's tragedy proved that earthquakes don't just destroy cities, they can shatter worldviews. Theologians who'd preached that disasters were divine punishment now faced an educated public demanding scientific answers. Maps of the quake's effects, drawn by early seismologists, became some of the first attempts to systematically study earthquakes. The Enlightenment's faith in reason over superstition didn't start in Lisbon, but the catastrophe gave it irreversible momentum. When the dust settled, more than buildings had fallen, an entire way of thinking about humanity's place in nature had been permanently upended. Deep in the American Midwest, where the Mississippi River carves its lazy path through fertile soil, the winter of 1811 began quietly. Then, on December 16th, the ground unleashed a violence no settler or Native American had ever witnessed. The first quake struck near New Madrid, a small river town in what's now Missouri, with such force that church bells rang as far away as Boston, over 1,000 miles east. But this was just the opening act. Over the next 3 months, the region would endure over 2,000 tremors, including at least 3 catastrophic quakes estimated between magnitude 7 and 8. The land itself seemed alive, buckling into waves that knocked pedestrians off their feet and sent trees snapping like twigs. The most surreal phenomenon occurred on the Mississippi. Eyewitnesses described water suddenly retreating from banks, leaving fish gasping on exposed mud, only to come roaring back in monstrous, churning walls. Some accounts claim the river ran backward for hours, its current overpowered by the upheaval of the land beneath it. Sand blows, fountains of groundwater and sediment erupting from fissures created miniature volcanoes across the landscape, while entire forests sank into liquefied earth, replaced by new lakes like Tennessee's Reelfoot. The quakes were so powerful that temporary waterfalls formed along the Mississippi, and the river's course shifted permanently in places. For Native American tribes like the Shawnee and Chickasaw, the disaster carried spiritual weight. The Shawnee leader Tecumseh had reportedly predicted the quakes as a sign of displeasure from the Great Spirit, urging tribes to unite against expanding American settlement. When the earth shook, many saw it as validation, a divine command to resist. The quakes accelerated migrations as tribes relocated from shattered villages, altering the region's demographic map. Meanwhile, settlers, many of whom believed such disasters couldn't happen far from coastal fault lines, were forced to confront nature's indifference to human assumptions. The New Madrid quakes also marked a turning point in American science. President James Madison received urgent reports from frontiersmen and army officers describing landscapes turned inside out. These accounts became foundational for early seismology, even without modern instruments. Naturalist John James Audubon, caught in the shaking, wrote vivid descriptions of the ground, rolling like waves, while painter John Chapman, better known as Johnny Appleseed, reportedly preached sermons about repentance to terrified settlers. The quake spurred one of the first serious American discussions about earthquake preparedness, though the lessons would fade as memory of the disaster dimmed. What makes the New Madrid sequence so haunting isn't just its scale, it's its reminder of hidden vulnerabilities. Unlike San Andreas or Japan's Ring of Fire, this region sits on an ancient, buried rift zone, dormant for centuries but never truly dead. Modern geologists warn that another quake of similar magnitude could devastate cities like Memphis or St. Louis, where infrastructure isn't built for seismic chaos. The 1811 quakes didn't just reshape rivers, they reshaped our understanding of where danger lurks, proving that sometimes the ground beneath our feet holds secrets even the land itself has forgotten. Dawn was just breaking over San Francisco on April 18, 1906, when the first shockwave ripped through the city. Lasting less than a minute, the quake, estimated between magnitude 7.9 and 8.3, unleashed chaos on a scale America had never seen. Gas lines snapped like dry twigs, water mains burst, and brick buildings crumbled into clouds of dust. But the real nightmare was only beginning, as survivors stumbled into streets littered with broken glass and fallen wires. Fires erupted across the city. With the water system destroyed, firefighters could only watch helplessly as flames jumped from block to block, fueled by broken gas pipes and wooden debris. For 3 days, the inferno raged unchecked, swallowing entire neighborhoods whole. When the smoke finally cleared, 80% of San Francisco lay in ruins, 3,000 were dead, and over 300,000 found themselves homeless in an instant. What made this disaster so transformative wasn't just the destruction, it was how it exposed the flaws of an entire era. San Francisco had been a booming metropolis, but its rapid growth came with cutting corners. Many buildings were constructed on unstable landfill or with shoddy materials, while emergency services were woefully unprepared. The quake didn't just level structures, it shattered complacency. Within months, California implemented some of the nation's first seismic building codes, requiring reinforced concrete and flexible steel frames that could sway rather than collapse. Engineers studied the wreckage like archaeologists, learning which designs had failed and which, like the steel skeleton core building, had miraculously survived. The scientific ripple effects were just as profound. Before 1906, seismology was a fringe science, often dismissed as superstition. But when geologist Henry Fielding Reed examined how the ground had shifted along the San Andreas Fault, he developed the elastic rebound theory, explaining how stress builds between tectonic plates until it snaps, the foundation of modern earthquake science. The disaster also spurred the creation of the Seismological Society of America, turning earthquake research into a legitimate field overnight. Yet the human stories reveal the deepest scars. Survivors described eerie moments of silence between the quake and the fires, when the city seemed to hold its breath. Others told of makeshift refugee camps in Golden Gate Park, where bankers and laborers slept side by side under donated blankets. The disaster erased social divisions, if only temporarily, proving that nature doesn't discriminate. San Francisco's rebirth became a testament to resilience. Within a decade, the city had rebuilt, its new skyline a blend of ambition and hard-won wisdom. But the lessons of 1906 echo far beyond California. Every earthquake-resistant bridge, every emergency evacuation plan, every seismic sensor humming quietly underground owes something to that April morning when the Earth reminded humanity who's really in charge. The fire-scorched ruins didn't just mark an ending, they ignited a new era of preparedness, proving that sometimes progress is born from the ashes of catastrophe. The morning of September 1st, 1923 began like any other in Tokyo, street vendors setting up stalls, children heading to school, fishermen hauling in their nets from Tokyo Bay. Then at 11:58 a.m., the earth beneath the Kanto plain convulsed with such force that clock towers stopped mid-tick. The Great Kanto Earthquake, estimated at magnitude 7.9, didn't just shake buildings, it liquefied the very ground beneath them. Brick structures crumbled instantly, while traditional wooden homes fared little better as overturned charcoal stoves ignited infernos that raced through the city. In Yokohama, the bustling port city southwest of Tokyo, the quake triggered a tsunami that drowned entire neighborhoods in minutes. But the worst devastation came from what survivors called the Dragon Twist, a swirling firestorm that consumed over 40 square kilometers, trapping thousands in a deadly maze of collapsing buildings and molten asphalt. Amid the chaos, a darker tragedy unfolded. As rumors spread that Korean immigrants were poisoning wells or looting ruins, vigilante mobs took to the streets armed with bamboo spears and swords. Over 6,000 Koreans were massacred in the days following the quake, a horrifying example of how disasters can amplify existing prejudices. The Japanese military and police, overwhelmed by the crisis, not only failed to stop the violence but in some cases actively participated. Newspapers fueled the hysteria with sensational headlines, while ordinary citizens formed armed patrols, turning on neighbors based on dialect or appearance. The pogroms revealed deep fractures in Japanese society, exposing racial tensions that had simmered beneath the surface of a rapidly modernizing nation. Yet from the ashes came transformation. The rebuilding of Tokyo became a national crusade, spearheaded by visionary planners who saw an opportunity to remake the city for the 20th century. Wide boulevards replaced narrow alleys to serve as fire breaks, while Western-style concrete buildings rose where wooden structures once stood. The disaster accelerated Japan's embrace of modern architecture and urban design, with innovations like earthquake-resistant reinforced concrete becoming standard. The quake also reshaped Japan's disaster preparedness. Meteorological stations were expanded, and September 1st was designated Disaster Prevention Day, marked by nationwide drills still observed today. But the psychological scars ran deep. Writers like Akutagawa Yunosuke captured the existential dread of the quake in stories where characters grappled with the fragility of human order. The disaster became a cultural touchstone, symbolizing both resilience and impermanence, a theme echoed in everything from kabuki theater to post-war anime. For Japan, the Great Kanto Earthquake wasn't just a geological event. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting both its capacity for cruelty and its extraordinary ability to rebuild. The flattened streets of Tokyo would give rise to a metropolis that dared to dream bigger, but the lessons of 1923 remain etched in steel and memory. When the earth shakes, it doesn't just test buildings, it tests who we really are. On May 31, 1970, the people of Peru's Ancash region were preparing for a Sunday afternoon, children playing in plazas, families gathering for meals, farmers tending crops on steep mountain slopes. Then at 3:23 p.m., the ground beneath the Andes Mountains lurched violently. The Ancash earthquake, a devastating magnitude 7.9, lasted just 45 seconds, but its aftermath would rewrite the rules of disaster response forever. The quake's epicenter lay 22 miles off the coast, yet its impact was magnified by geography. The shaking dislodged a massive slab of glacial ice from Mount Huascarán, Peru's tallest peak. As the ice crashed down, it ripped apart mountainsides, gathering rock and mud into an avalanche moving at over 100 miles per hour. Within minutes, this wall of debris, half a mile wide and nearly 100 feet tall, slammed into the town of Yungay. Witnesses described a thunderous roar, then eerie silence. When the dust settled, Yungay had vanished, buried under 30 feet of earth. Only the tops of palm trees and the cathedral's 4 statues of Christ remained visible, grim markers of a town erased. The death toll reached 70,000, with entire generations lost in an instant. What made the tragedy even more heartbreaking was its preventable nature. Many buildings in Yungay and nearby Huaraz had been constructed with unreinforced adobe, cheap, traditional materials that crumbled like chalk under seismic stress. The avalanche's path had been known for centuries. Spanish colonial records warned of past landslides in the same valley. Yet rapid population growth and lax regulations meant towns kept expanding into harm's way. When the disaster struck, Peru had no national emergency response system, leaving survivors to dig through rubble with bare hands as aid trickled in days later. But from this catastrophe emerged something transformative. The Ancash disaster became a global wake-up call, spurring innovations in both engineering and policy. Peruvian engineers pioneered new techniques for earthquake-resistant adobe, mixing straw and synthetic fibers to strengthen traditional materials. The United Nations launched the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, with Yungay as its stark case study. Perhaps most importantly, the quake reshaped how scientists understood secondary hazards, the landslides, floods, and fires that often claim more lives than the initial tremor. Modern risk assessments now map not just fault lines but unstable slopes and liquefaction zones, a direct legacy of 1970. Today, the ruins of Yungay stand as a memorial park, its shattered cathedral bell tower left half-buried like a frozen scream. The tragedy taught the world that earthquakes don't kill people, collapse and complacency do. Every reinforced schoolhouse in seismic zones, every early warning system, every disaster drill owes a debt to the lessons carved into that mountainside. The Earth may move without warning, but humanity no longer has the excuse of being unprepared. At 3:42 in the morning on July 28, 1976, the industrial city of Tangshan was asleep when the Earth split open without warning. The quake struck with such sudden violence that seismographs in Beijing, 100 miles away, maxed out their scales trying to measure it. Later estimates placed the magnitude at 7.8, comparable to San Francisco's 1906 disaster. But Tangshan's tragedy unfolded under vastly different circumstances. Built on unstable alluvial soil with virtually no earthquake-resistant structures, the city essentially pancaked in seconds. 93% of residential buildings and 80% of industrial facilities collapsed, trapping hundreds of thousands under concrete slabs in the pre-dawn darkness. Survivors described the sound as 1,000 freight trains colliding, followed by an eerie silence broken only by distant screams and the occasional explosion from ruptured gas lines. What made Tangshan's story so unique wasn't just the scale of destruction, it was the veil of secrecy that followed. China was in the throes of the Cultural Revolution, a period when admitting vulnerability was seen as weakness. Initial reports downplayed the disaster, claiming only minor damage. For days, state media focused on propaganda about heroic workers rebuilding, while foreign journalists were barred from the area. The truth was far grimmer. A death toll eventually acknowledged as 240,000, with another 160,000 severely injured. Without official requests for help, international aid organizations watched helplessly as survivors dug through rubble with their hands, lacking even basic medical supplies. When relief finally arrived, it came with strings attached. East German and Albanian teams were welcomed as communist allies, while offers from the U.S. US and Japan were initially refused. The political fallout reshaped China's approach to disasters. After Chairman Mao's death that September, the new leadership quietly recognized how secrecy had cost lives. Tangshan became the catalyst for China's first modern seismic building codes and the creation of emergency response teams. Yet the city's rebirth came at a psychological cost. Survivors were relocated to hastily built new villages with strict orders to move forward, leaving grief unprocessed. Many developed what doctors called earthquake psychosis, nightmares, numbness, and an inability to speak about their experiences. Only in the 1990s did memoirs and oral histories begin to surface, revealing the full horror of those buried alive, waiting for help that came too late. Tangshan's legacy is a paradox, a city that rose from ruins to become a modern industrial powerhouse, yet whose deepest wounds remain half-hidden. The meticulously rebuilt downtown, with its earthquake memorial sculpture of fractured clock hands frozen at 3:42, stands as both a tribute and a warning. Disasters test more than buildings, they test the systems meant to protect us. When politics trumps humanity, the aftershocks last far longer than the quake. The morning of December 26, 2004, dawned with terrifying normalcy across the Indian Ocean. Tourists lounged on Thai beaches, fishermen cast nets off Sri Lankan shores, and families gathered for breakfast in Banda Aceh, all unaware that 100 miles off Sumatra's coast, the seafloor was tearing apart. The rupture began 20 miles beneath the surface, where the Indian plate suddenly lurched beneath the Burma plate. Within minutes, a 9.1 magnitude earthquake, the third strongest ever recorded, unleashed enough energy to power the entire United States for 6 months. But the quake itself was just the opening act. As the seabed heaved upward by 30 feet, it displaced trillions of gallons of water, sending waves racing outward at 500 miles per hour, the speed of a commercial jet. What made this disaster so unprecedented was its geographic cruelty. Unlike typical tsunamis that target one coastline, these waves radiated in all directions, striking 14 countries across 2 continents. In Banda Aceh, closest to the epicenter, 30-meter walls of water erased entire neighborhoods, carrying ships inland and depositing them atop buildings. Tourists in Phuket watched in horror as the ocean violently retreated before surging back, flipping cars and swallowing beachfront hotels whole. The waves even reached Africa's east coast, killing people in Somalia who'd never heard the word tsunami. The final toll was staggering: 230,000 lives lost, millions displaced, and entire ecosystems scoured from existence. Yet amid the devastation emerged stories of both heartbreaking failure and extraordinary ingenuity. Many coastal communities had no warning systems in Sri Lanka. Elephants reportedly fled inland minutes before the waves hit, while humans remained oblivious. But the disaster sparked the most rapid evolution in disaster preparedness the world had ever seen. Within months, the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning System was established, linking 28 countries with deep-sea sensors and satellite alerts. Scientists realized tsunamis could be detected by subtle changes in atmospheric pressure, leading to innovations like GPS-equipped buoys that track wave formations in real time. The humanitarian response rewrote the playbook for global aid. Donations poured in at unprecedented levels, over $14 billion, while NGOs coordinated relief with military precision. Lessons learned in Aceh informed responses to later disasters like Haiti's earthquake, proving that decentralized aid networks could be more effective than top-down approaches. Perhaps most importantly, the tsunami shattered the illusion that some regions are safe from mega-disasters. A generation grew up with tsunami drills in schools from Indonesia to Greece, their awareness forever shaped by that December morning when the ocean revealed its terrifying power. The 2004 disaster left a paradoxical legacy, both a benchmark for suffering and a catalyst for progress. Visiting the tsunami memorials today, you'll find names etched in stone next to towering seawalls and evacuation route signs. The waves took countless lives, but they also forced humanity to confront its vulnerability with newfound humility and cooperation. In the end, the deadliest tsunami in recorded history didn't just change coastlines, it changed how the world prepares for the unpredictable, proving that even in our darkest hours, we're capable of learning, adapting, and ultimately surviving together. March 11, 2011 was a day etched into Japan's collective memory, not just for the shaking earth, but for the cascade of disasters that followed. At 2:46 in the afternoon, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake, the strongest ever recorded in Japan, ripped through the Pacific floor 80 miles east of Sendai. The initial tremors lasted 6 brutal minutes, toppling buildings, buckling roads, and triggering landslides across the Tohoku region, but the real horror was still offshore. As the seafloor lurched upward by 30 feet, it displaced enough water to send a tsunami racing toward the coast at jetliner speed. 40 minutes after the quake, waves as tall as 4-story buildings slammed into the shoreline, sweeping entire towns out to sea. The world watched in stunned silence as live footage showed black walls of water carrying ships, cars, and even whole houses inland like toys in a bathtub. The tsunami's force was so immense it tore through 3-story concrete seawalls designed to withstand far smaller waves. Over 18,000 lives were lost in minutes, with thousands more never recovered. But the disaster's most far-reaching consequence unfolded at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, where the tsunami's surge overwhelmed backup generators, triggering meltdowns in 3 reactors. The resulting radiation leaks forced 160,000 people to evacuate, creating ghost towns where Geiger counters now outnumber residents. Fukushima became a global turning point, exposing the fragile illusion of human control over nature. Japan, a technological powerhouse renowned for earthquake preparedness, had built its nuclear facilities to withstand strong quakes, but not a 1-2 punch of this scale. The disaster forced nations worldwide to reconsider their reliance on nuclear energy. Germany announced plans to phase out all reactors within a decade, while other countries shelved expansion plans. Even France, which gets 70% of its power from nuclear plants, launched sweeping safety reviews. The crisis also spurred innovations in renewable energy, as Japan poured billions into solar and wind projects to fill the gap left by idled reactors. Yet Fukushima's legacy isn't just about energy, it's about humility. Modern seismology now recognizes maximum credible earthquakes as woefully inadequate metrics, replaced by probabilistic risk assessments that account for the unimaginable. Coastal reactors worldwide have upgraded flood barriers, installed passive cooling systems, and stockpiled mobile generators, but perhaps the most profound change was psychological. For centuries, humanity viewed natural disasters as challenges to be engineered away. Fukushima forced a reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that some forces defy prediction, and that resilience means planning for failure, not just success. Today, Fukushima's exclusion zone remains a haunting landscape of overgrown streets and abandoned homes, dotted with black bags of contaminated soil. Yet amid the desolation, there are signs of renewal. Some villages have reopened after rigorous decontamination, their returnees farming sunflowers believed to absorb radiation from the soil. The disaster didn't just change Japan, it rewrote the playbook for how technologically advanced societies coexist with the planet's raw power. The lesson echoes far beyond tsunami warnings or reactor designs. In our race to harness nature, we must never forget to respect it. Long before scientists mapped fault lines or measured seismic waves, humanity turned to the divine to explain the Earth's violent tremors. In ancient Greece, sailors and farmers alike prayed to Poseidon, the god whose trident could split the ground as easily as it stirred the seas. Temples built in his honor often stood near coastal cliffs, places where the earth and water met, where the tremors felt strongest. When the ground shook, it wasn't just geology at work. It was the caprice of an unpredictable deity, demanding tribute or expressing wrath. This wasn't mere superstition, it was a way to impose order on chaos, to give meaning to something that felt random and terrifying. Across the Pacific, the Maya saw earthquakes through a different lens. Their pantheon included a host of underworld gods, among them the fearsome Cabrakan, the mountain mover. According to the Popol Vuh, their sacred text, Cabrakan could topple peaks with a single step, his anger shaking the very foundations of the world. But unlike Poseidon's unpredictable fury, Maya beliefs tied earthquakes to cycles, cosmic corrections meant to maintain balance. A quake wasn't just destruction, it was renewal, clearing the way for new growth. Archaeologists have found evidence that the Maya even designed their cities with seismic activity in mind, aligning temples to withstand tremors while interpreting them as divine messages. In Japan, the legend of Namezu offered a strikingly vivid explanation. This giant catfish, trapped beneath the islands by the god Kashima, would thrash when Kashima's attention slipped, causing the land above to shudder. Woodblock prints from the Edo period show townspeople scolding the fish or bribing it with offerings, a blend of humor and reverence that reflected daily life in a quake-prone land. What's fascinating isn't just the myth itself, but how it evolved. After the devastating 1855 Ansei earthquake, artists depicted Namezu not just as a villain, but as a force of justice, punishing corrupt merchants and greedy officials. The Earth's violence, in other words, became a moral lesson. These stories share a common thread. They transform fear into narrative. For the Norse, earthquakes signaled Loki's struggles in his bonds, while Hindu texts describe the world resting on the tusks of a cosmic boar that occasionally shifted its weight. Even the Bible wove quakes into pivotal moments, from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah to the trembling earth at Christ's crucifixion. What's remarkable is how these tales, born continents apart, all grappled with the same existential question: how do you live on land that can betray you at any moment? The answer, it seems, was to make the Earth a character in humanity's story, one with motives, moods, and a voice. When the ground spoke, our ancestors listened, not with seismographs, but with rituals, sacrifices, and art. Today, we understand the mechanics of plate tectonics, but these myths linger in our language. We still say the Earth groans or shudders as if it's alive. Maybe that's the most enduring legacy of these ancient beliefs. They remind us that science explains how the Earth moves, but it's stories that help us make sense of what it means to stand on ground that never truly stands still. Trade routes have always been the lifeblood of civilizations, threading through deserts, scaling mountains, and hugging coastlines to connect distant cultures. But beneath these carefully charted paths lurked an unpredictable force: earthquakes that could rewrite the rules of commerce in an instant. Take Antioch, once the third largest city in the Roman Empire, and a glittering hub where spices from India met silk from China. When the earthquake of 526 CE reduced its grand bazaars to rubble, the shockwaves rippled far beyond its broken walls. Merchants who'd relied on Antioch's bustling ports suddenly found themselves stranded, their goods rotting in warehouses that no longer existed. Within months, trade began bypassing the crippled city entirely, shifting north to lesser-known towns like Aleppo, which blossomed into a new economic powerhouse almost overnight. The Silk Road, that legendary network of caravan trails linking Europe to Asia, faced similar seismic sabotage. The ancient city of Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, was the eastern anchor of the route, a metropolis where Persian glass and Roman gold changed hands. But when a massive quake struck in 780 CE, toppling its towering pagodas and buckling its storied gates, traders were forced to reroute through less convenient mountain passes. The detour added weeks to journeys, driving up costs and reshaping which goods were worth transporting. Luxuries like jade and ivory still moved, but bulk commodities like grain or timber became too expensive to carry. Over time, these subtle shifts altered entire economies, privileging regions that happened to lie on the new paths while starving others of wealth. Perhaps no example is more dramatic than the fate of the port city of Port Royal in Jamaica. Before an earthquake swallowed half the town into the sea in 1692, it was the Caribbean's wealthiest pirate haven, a place where Spanish silver and English rum flowed as freely as seawater. After the disaster, surviving merchants fled to nearby Kingston, transforming what had been a sleepy fishing village into a thriving colonial capital. The quake didn't just destroy a city, it redirected the flow of Atlantic trade, altering the balance of power in the New World. What's fascinating is how societies adapted to these seismic curveballs. After earthquakes shattered traditional routes, resourceful traders often pioneered daring alternatives. When tremors closed mountain passes along the Incan road system, runners began carrying messages along coastal trails instead, inadvertently strengthening maritime trade networks. In the Ottoman Empire, after the 1556 quake devastated Aleppo's rival, Damascus, Aleppo's merchants capitalized on the chaos by lobbying for tax breaks, turning their city into the region's undisputed commercial heart. These stories reveal a paradox. While earthquakes are agents of destruction, they're also catalysts for reinvention. When the ground shakes, it doesn't just topple buildings, it topples assumptions about where wealth should flow and who gets to control it. The next time you glance at a map of ancient trade routes, remember, those lines weren't drawn just by geography or politics, but by the silent, shifting faults beneath our feet. Warfare has always been a brutal game of opportunity, and throughout history, earthquakes have provided the ultimate opening for conquest. When the ground shakes and cities crumble, defenses collapse not just physically but psychologically, leaving societies vulnerable to those ruthless enough to strike when they're down. Take Sparta in 464 BCE. The quake that killed thousands also shattered the illusion of Spartan invincibility. Persia, watching from across the Aegean, saw a chance to exploit the chaos. Though their invasion ultimately failed, the attempt revealed a chilling truth: natural disasters could be as decisive as any army, turning the earth itself into an unwitting ally of conquest. But Sparta wasn't the only example. In 1556, when China's Shongsi province lay in ruins after its catastrophic quake, Mongol raiders swept in, pillaging what little remained. The Ming dynasty, already reeling from the disaster, found itself fighting on two fronts against the devastation and opportunistic invaders. Similarly, when a massive quake struck Lisbon in 1755, Spain briefly considered invading a crippled Portugal, only backing down when Britain pledged support for the shattered ally. Earthquakes didn't just weaken cities, they redrew the calculus of power in real time, forcing empires to choose between mercy and opportunism. Some commanders didn't just wait for quakes, they learned to anticipate them. The Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, besieging the Hungarian fortress of Eger in 1552, reportedly delayed his final assault after local miners warned of frequent tremors in the region. When the ground finally shook, his cannons targeted weakened sections of the walls, turning geology into a siege weapon. Centuries later, during World War II, Japanese strategists studied seismic maps before occupying Pacific Islands, knowing quake-prone regions would hinder Allied supply lines long after the fighting stopped. The darkest twist came when armies began engineering disasters. While no historical army could literally trigger quakes, they mastered the art of simulating them. During the Roman siege of Ambracia in 189 BCE, soldiers dug tunnels beneath the city walls, then collapsed them, creating artificial tremors that terrified defenders into surrender. The tactic was so effective it became standard practice, a precursor to modern sapper warfare. Even today, some speculate that underground nuclear tests could destabilize fault lines, blurring the line between warfare and geological sabotage. What's haunting isn't just the strategy, but the psychology behind it. Earthquakes erase the rules, reducing order to rubble and tempting the strong to prey on the weak. But they also reveal a deeper truth. Civilization is fragile, and the thin veneer of diplomacy cracks as easily as earthquake-shattered stone. From Persia's failed gamble to Mongol horsemen scavenging ruins, history shows that when the ground shakes, humanity's darkest instincts often shake loose with it. Yet amid the opportunism, there are flashes of solidarity, like the British ships that raced to Lisbon with aid, not armies. Disasters test more than buildings. They test who we become when the world falls apart. Beneath layers of silt and centuries of myth, the ancient Greek city of Helike vanished overnight in 373 BCE. Historians like Strabo described how a powerful earthquake sank the entire city beneath the waves, drowning its people and leaving only ghostly ripples where streets once bustled with life. For over 2,000 years, Helike existed only in legends until 1988, when archaeologists finally pinpointed its remains buried under coastal sediment near the Gulf of Corinth. Excavations revealed a snapshot frozen in disaster, collapsed walls, pottery still stacked in kitchens, and even the grooves of chariot wheels pressed into suddenly submerged roads. The earthquake hadn't just destroyed Helike, it had preserved it like a fly in amber, offering modern researchers an unparalleled window into classical Greece's political and religious life. Half a world away, a similar fate befell Jamaica's infamous Port Royal in 1692. Once called the wickedest city on earth, this pirate haven thrived on stolen Spanish gold and smuggled rum until a June morning when the ground liquefied beneath its streets. Within minutes, 2/3 of the city slid into the Caribbean, taking taverns, brothels, and warehouses straight to the seafloor. What made Port Royal's rediscovery so extraordinary was the state of preservation sealed in oxygen-deprived mud. Artifacts survived with eerie freshness. Archaeologists recovered leather shoes still supple, pewter plates tarnished but intact, and even a pocket watch stopped at exactly 11:43, the moment the quake struck. These weren't just relics, they were time-stamped witnesses to a society caught mid-breath. What makes these sites so invaluable isn't just their artifacts, but the stories they rewrite. Helike's ruins confirmed ancient accounts of its role as a religious center dedicated to Poseidon, with temple alignments matching descriptions from Homer's Iliad. Port Royal's debris shattered romanticized pirate myths, revealing instead a hyper-capitalist hellscape where surgeons doubled as smugglers and slave auctions operated next to churches. Unlike carefully curated tombs or ceremonial sites, earthquake-buried cities preserve everyday life in brutal honesty. A broken wine jug here, a child's toy there, all untouched by the sanitizing hand of time. Modern technology has turned these disasters into scientific gold mines. Ground-penetrating radar now maps buried structures without disturbing fragile remains, while chemical analysis of Port Royal's submerged timbers tracks climate patterns from 3 centuries ago. Even the bacteria trapped in Helike sediment tell a story. revealing how earthquakes altered coastal ecosystems overnight. These aren't just excavations, they're high-tech autopsies of civilization's sudden endings. Yet the most haunting lesson from these sites isn't about the past, it's about the future. Both Helike and Port Royal were built on geologically active land, their prosperity blinding them to the risks beneath their feet. As we uncover their stories, we're forced to ask, which of our cities might someday become cautionary tales for archaeologists of the far future? The ruins whisper a warning across the ages. The ground remembers even when we forget. When the ground shakes with enough force to flatten cities, humanity faces a stark choice: rebuild the same way and risk repeating history, or innovate. Ancient Rome chose the latter after earthquakes shattered its empire's pride. Engineers studying collapsed structures noticed something curious. Buildings made with volcanic ash mixed into concrete often survived when others crumbled. This wasn't just luck. The ash created microscopic fibers that flexed under stress, giving the material a surprising ability to bend rather than break. The Pantheon, still standing after 2,000 years and countless quakes, owes its endurance to this revolutionary blend. The Romans didn't just reconstruct, they reimagined construction itself, proving that disaster could be the mother of invention. Half a world away, Japan's carpenters developed their own seismic wisdom through centuries of trial and error. Traditional pagodas built with interlocking wooden brackets swayed like trees in a storm during quakes, their flexible joints absorbing shocks that would topple rigid towers. The 5-story Horyu-ji temple, erected in 707 CE, has weathered over 1,400 years of tremors thanks to this ingenious design. Modern engineers studying these ancient structures discovered something astonishing: the central pillar, instead of being anchored firmly, actually dangles slightly above the base, acting like a pendulum to counteract seismic forces. It's a principle now echoed in Taipei 101's massive tuned mass damper, a 700-ton steel ball that swings to neutralize sway during typhoons and quakes. The 20th century brought a seismic revolution in materials science. After the 1995 Kobe earthquake exposed the fatal flaw of brittle concrete, Japanese researchers pioneered ultra-high-performance fiber reinforced concrete, a material so tough it can heal small cracks by reacting with rainwater. Skyscrapers in Tokyo now rise on base isolators, giant rubber and steel bearings that let buildings slide harmlessly during quakes. The Mori Tower in Roppongi Hills rides on 380 of these isolators, capable of absorbing a magnitude 7 quake with minimal damage. Meanwhile, in California, engineers took inspiration from automobile crumple zones, designing buildings with sacrificial components that absorb energy while protecting critical load-bearing structures. Perhaps the most poetic innovation comes from Peru, where modern architects have resurrected ancient techniques. After the 2007 Pisco earthquake, builders in Lima began incorporating flexible quincha walls, a traditional mix of cane and mud, into modern steel frames. The result: structures that blend indigenous knowledge with cutting-edge engineering, creating homes that sway without collapsing during tremors. Similarly, in Istanbul, architects are reviving Byzantine chain walls, interlocking stone bands that distribute seismic forces as they retrofit centuries-old mosques for future quakes. These breakthroughs reveal a profound truth: every seismic disaster leaves behind not just ruins, but blueprints for survival. From Roman concrete to AI-controlled damping systems, humanity's architectural evolution mirrors our growing dialogue with the Earth's restless energy. The greatest tribute to quake victims isn't just memorials, it's buildings that stand tall when the next big one hits, whispering across time. We learned, we adapted, we honored your loss by making sure it wouldn't happen again. The screams fade first, That's what survivors of the Lisbon earthquake of 1755 often recalled, not the initial roar of collapsing buildings or the metallic groan of buckling church bells, but the eerie silence that followed, punctuated only by muffled cries from beneath the rubble. One priest's diary describes holding a dying man's hand through a crack in the debris, whispering prayers until the fingers went limp. These weren't just physical injuries, they were psychic fractures that reshaped how survivors saw the world. Modern psychologists studying accounts from Lisbon recognize classic trauma responses, dissociative episodes where victims reported watching their own suffering from above, or the compulsive retelling of disaster stories as the brain struggled to process the unimaginable. Tangshan survivors in 1976 faced a different kind of hell. Buried alive in pitch darkness, many experienced auditory hallucinations, phantom voices of loved ones calling their names, or the sound of rescuers digging when no one was there. Doctors later documented earthquake psychosis in over 40% of survivors, with symptoms ranging from hysterical paralysis to an inability to speak for months. Yet amid the devastation emerged astonishing acts of resilience. A teenage girl trapped under her school for 8 days survived by sipping rainwater from a torn textbook, focusing on memorizing its pages to keep her mind from unraveling. Another survivor, pinned under concrete with a broken pelvis, sang revolutionary songs to keep nearby children calm until help arrived, a makeshift therapy session in the ruins. What's striking isn't just the trauma, but how cultural frameworks shaped recovery. Lisbon's survivors grappled with existential rage. Why would God punish a devoutly Catholic city? While Tangshan's victims often repressed grief to align with Mao-era stoicism. Letters from Lisbon survivors reveal agonized debates about divine justice, with some abandoning faith entirely and others becoming fanatically religious. In contrast, Tangshan's oral histories, only shared decades later, describe survivors guiltily hiding nightmares to avoid being seen as weak. Both disasters birthed unexpected social bonds. Lisbon's rich and poor sheltered together in tent cities, while Tangshan's quake families, groups of orphans raised communally, forged lifelong connections from shared loss. Modern disaster psychology traces its roots to these seismic tragedies. The term post-traumatic growth emerged from studying how survivors of events like Tangshan often developed profound new priorities, less interest in material wealth, deeper family ties. Therapists now recognize that healing isn't about forgetting, but rewriting the disaster's role in one's story. A Lisbon merchant who lost his fortune became a celebrated poet. A Tangshan factory worker turned her trauma into a campaign for earthquake preparedness. Their journeys reveal a universal truth: when the ground stops shaking, the real quake is just beginning. A seismic shift in the soul that can, with time, build new landscapes of meaning from the rubble of the old. The wail of a siren cuts through the morning calm in Mexico City, a sound that means the ground is already moving, just not here yet. Thanks to an ingenious network of sensors along the Pacific coast, the capital gets precious seconds of warning when quakes strike hundreds of miles away. Those 20 to 50 seconds might seem insignificant, but they're enough to halt subway trains, shut down gas lines, and send school children diving under desks. This system, honed since the devastating 1985 quake, represents one of humanity's most remarkable defenses against seismic chaos. Yet it's built on a paradox. We can predict earthquakes the way a weather forecaster spots a hurricane, but only after the disaster has already begun. Japan's early warning network takes this further, harnessing the speed of digital signals to outrun seismic waves. When the 2011 Tohoku quake ruptured the seafloor, alerts flashed across smartphones and TV screens before the shaking reached Tokyo, 180 miles away. The system exploits a quirk of physics. While destructive seismic waves travel at about 2 miles per second, electronic warnings move at the speed of light. But even these technological marvels have limits. During the Kumamoto quakes of 2016, some residents received alerts after the shaking had already begun, a cruel reminder that sensors can't always keep pace with nature's unpredictability. The real challenge lies beyond these high-tech havens. In earthquake-prone regions from Nepal to Ecuador, millions still live without any warning infrastructure. Consider the 2015 Gorkha quake in Nepal. Villages nestled against the Himalayas had no sensors, no sirens, just the terrifying lurch of the ground itself as it swallowed homes whole. Scientists estimate a 30-second warning could have saved thousands, yet the cost of deploying such systems remains prohibitive for many nations. Even in wealthy California, the Shake Alert system only achieved full public rollout in 2021 after decades of piecemeal development, leaving generations vulnerable in the interim. What's emerging, though, is a patchwork of low-tech innovations to fill the gaps. In Chile, fishermen noticed changes in bioluminescent algae before major quakes, a phenomenon now being studied for grassroots early detection. Turkish engineers have repurposed old smartphones as makeshift seismometers, creating a crowdsourced alert network. Perhaps most remarkably, researchers at Stanford recently trained AI to detect faint electromagnetic pulses that some believe precede major quakes, though the scientific community remains divided on their reliability. The cruel truth is this: no warning system can eliminate risk entirely. Buildings still collapse, landslides still bury villages, and tsunamis still race toward unsuspecting coasts. But every second of warning is a thread of control snatched back from chaos, a chance for a surgeon to lower her scalpel or a parent to clutch their child tighter. As our planet's restless crust continues its slow dance, these systems don't just save lives, they preserve something equally fragile: our belief that even in the face of nature's fury, we're not entirely powerless. The ground shaking beneath Kobe, Japan on January 17, 1995, lasted just 20 seconds, but the financial aftershocks reverberated for years. When the magnitude 6.9 quake shattered highways, buckled railways, and turned the bustling port into a twisted graveyard of cranes, it exposed something far more fragile than concrete: the invisible threads binding modern economies together. The disaster's $200 billion price tag wasn't just about broken buildings. It was a masterclass in how tightly prosperity is tethered to infrastructure. Kobe's port had handled nearly 12% of Japan's trade, a vital link in supply chains stretching from Osaka's factories to Los Angeles store shelves. Within hours of the quake, Toyota suspended production at 20 plants nationwide, not because their facilities were damaged, but because critical parts couldn't reach assembly lines. The ripple effect even crossed oceans. California car dealers faced shortages of Japanese imports, while Korean shipbuilders scrambled to fill orders for replacement containers. What made Kobe's case unique was how it revealed hidden vulnerabilities in just-in-time economies. Supermarkets in Tokyo, 300 miles away, ran out of milk within days as dairy trucks sat gridlocked on fractured highways. Electronics giants like Panasonic discovered single-source suppliers buried under rubble, exposing the risk of over-reliance on localized production. The disaster forced a global reckoning. Corporations from Germany to Texas began mapping their supply chains like battlefield generals, identifying choke points and diversifying sources. Japan itself underwent an infrastructure revolution, replacing rigid concrete structures with flexible designs and decentralizing critical industries. The iconic Akashi Kaikayo Bridge, completed 3 years later, incorporated seismic dampers that could absorb a magnitude 8.5 quake, a direct response to Kobe's lessons. Yet the most profound economic shift wasn't in boardrooms but in insurance policies. Before Kobe, many assumed major quakes were California's problem. The disaster proved otherwise, triggering a surge in catastrophe bonds, high-risk investments that pay out when disasters strike. Today, these financial instruments form a $300 billion market, essentially allowing investors to bet against the planet's stability. It's a grim irony that Kobe's suffering spawned an entire industry profiting from disaster risk, but also a testament to how deeply earthquakes rewrite economic rules. The legacy of that January morning lives on every time a warehouse manager stocks extra inventory or an engineer specifies earthquake-resistant steel. Kobe taught the world that in our interconnected age, the true cost of a quake isn't measured in collapsed buildings alone. It's calculated in halted production lines, rerouted cargo ships, and the sobering realization that prosperity built on fragile ground is no prosperity at all. When the earth moves, it doesn't just shake soil, it shakes the very foundations of how we organize wealth, trade, and survival. Glaciers may seem like silent sentinels of the polar and alpine regions, but their slow-motion disappearance could be setting off geological alarm bells far beneath our feet. As these colossal ice sheets melt at unprecedented rates, they're not just raising sea levels, they're literally lightening the load on Earth's crust, and the planet's tectonic plates are responding in ways scientists are only beginning to understand. Picture a sleeping giant suddenly freed from a heavy blanket. The Earth's crust, relieved of billions of tons of ice pressure, begins to rebound upward in a process called isostatic rebound. This isn't just theoretical in Alaska. Parts of the coastline are rising nearly 3 centimeters per year as glaciers retreat, like a compressed spring finally released. The connection between ice loss and earthquakes first gained serious attention after a series of unusual tremors in Greenland between 2007 and 2013, as the island's ice sheet shed over 250 gigatons of mass. Seismometers recorded a cluster of magnitude 5 quakes far stronger than typical glacial ice quakes. Geologists realized that disappearing ice was reducing pressure on underlying faults, allowing long dormant fractures in the bedrock to slip. Similar patterns emerged in Canada's St. Elias Mountains, where retreating glaciers coincided with a 7-fold increase in seismic activity. The mechanics are surprisingly intuitive. Imagine pressing down on a warped wooden floorboard. Your weight keeps it stable, but lift your foot, and the board suddenly pops back up with a jolt. What makes this phenomenon particularly troubling is its potential for chain reactions. As glacial meltwater seeps into fractures, it can lubricate fault lines, making them more prone to slip. In Iceland, researchers have documented volcanic eruptions triggered by melting ice caps. The reduced pressure allows magma chambers to expand more easily. While most climate-linked quakes currently occur in remote polar regions, the implications could ripple outward. In tectonically active coastal areas like Chile or New Zealand, where glaciers are retreating rapidly, the combination of rising crust and increased groundwater could destabilize fault systems that haven't moved in centuries. Perhaps the most sobering realization is the timescale at play. Unlike atmospheric changes that unfold over years, the Earth's crust responds to ice loss over decades or even centuries, meaning the seismic consequences of today's melting may not fully manifest until our grandchildren's era. Some models suggest parts of Scandinavia, still rebounding from the last ice age 12,000 years later, could experience renewed quakes as modern glaciers vanish. This creates a haunting paradox. By the time we detect clear patterns of climate-induced seismicity, the processes may already be irreversible. Yet there's an unexpected silver lining in this research. By studying how ice loss affects faults, scientists are gaining unprecedented insights into earthquake prediction. In British Columbia, precise measurements of glacial retreat are helping refine models of the Cascadia subduction zone, a sleeping giant capable of generating a magnitude 9 megaquake. The emerging field of cryoseismology is proving that climate science and seismology aren't separate disciplines, but interconnected pieces of our planet's story. As we alter Earth's surface through warming, we're not just changing the weather, we're poking the sleeping dragon of geology itself, learning in real time how finely balanced our planet's destructive forces truly are. History has a way of teaching the same lesson across centuries. When the Earth shakes, the prepared survive. Take the ancient Minoans of Crete, whose vibrant frescoes depict not just dolphins and dancers, but something far more practical: storage rooms packed with emergency supplies. Archaeologists excavating Akrotiri found massive clay jars called pithoi, still containing preserved grains, olives, and dried fish, proof that Bronze Age civilizations understood the need to stockpile essentials long before modern disaster kits became standard advice. Fast forward to Edo period Japan, where samurai families kept earthquake bags by their beds, sturdy sacks filled with hardtack rice crackers, medicinal herbs, and even folded maps showing evacuation routes to high ground. These weren't paranoid precautions, they were hard-won wisdom from generations living on volatile fault lines. Modern science confirms what these ancient cultures knew instinctively. After studying earthquake survivors from California to Kathmandu, researchers found one consistent factor separating those who thrived from those who struggled: preparation. A well-stocked emergency kit isn't just about having bottled water and bandages, it's about buying time. When the 1994 Northridge quake knocked out power across Los Angeles, households with solar-charged flashlights and hand-crank radios could access critical information while others waited days for help. But true preparedness goes beyond gear. The Chilean government's rigorous earthquake drills, mandatory in schools and workplaces, meant that when the 8th strongest quake in recorded history struck in 2010, most citizens knew exactly how to react, contributing to miraculously low casualties despite the magnitude 8.8 tremors. Your home itself can be your first line of defense. Traditional Japanese joinery techniques, developed over centuries, allowed wooden structures to sway without collapsing, a principle now echoed in modern base-isolated buildings. Homeowners in seismic zones are rediscovering these time-tested methods, combining them with contemporary materials. Simple retrofits like bolting houses to foundations or installing flexible gas lines can prevent up to 80% of quake-related injuries. Even renters can apply this wisdom, securing heavy furniture with earthquake putty, a trick borrowed from museums protecting priceless artifacts, or knowing which interior doorways, not the mythic doorframe, actually provide shelter in collapsing structures. The most overlooked preparation might be mental mapping. Before the 2011 Christchurch earthquake, a local geology teacher had spent years leading students on walking tours, identifying safe zones and unstable structures. When the quake hit, those students became inadvertent community leaders, guiding panicked crowds away from dangerous areas. This mirrors findings from tsunami-prone regions in Indonesia, where villages that practiced evacuation drills patterned after ancestral, Smong oral traditions suffered far fewer losses than neighboring communities. The lesson transcends cultures. Disaster readiness isn't about living in fear, it's about reclaiming agency. When you've rehearsed the steps, when your supplies are organized, when your home is secured, you're not just surviving the unpredictable, you're rewriting the script from victim to resilient protagonist in your own survival story. Perhaps the most profound preparation is recognizing that earthquakes don't discriminate. They test rich and poor, ancient and modern societies alike. The difference between chaos and calm often comes down to simple, deliberate choices made long before the ground begins to tremble. From Minoan storage jars to smartphone alert systems, humanity's enduring quest isn't to prevent earthquakes but to outsmart them, one prepared household, one reinforced building, one practiced drill at a time. From the moment ancient scribes etched their first trembling accounts onto oracle bones to today's satellites tracking tectonic shifts in real time, earthquakes have been far more than natural disasters. They've been catalysts, forcing humanity to confront its own impermanence while sparking some of our most ingenious leaps forward. The rubble of Antioch didn't just mark the end of a city. It became the blueprint for Byzantine engineers who reimagined architecture with flexible mortar. The ashes of Lisbon didn't merely smolder, they ignited the Enlightenment's fiery debates about reason versus divine will. Even now, as climate change destabilizes glaciers and strains fault lines, we're witnessing history's oldest lesson play out once more. The ground beneath us is alive, restless, and utterly indifferent to our plans. But here's the paradox: every time the Earth reminds us of our fragility, we respond with stubborn resilience. Look at Tokyo's skyline, where skyscrapers sway on massive rubber bearings, a direct descendant of those wooden pagodas that danced through centuries of tremors. Or consider how Chile's strict building codes, forged in the crucible of the 1960 Valdivia quake, saved countless lives during the 2010 megathrust event. These aren't just engineering triumphs, they're testaments to our ability to listen when the planet speaks. The challenge now is to widen that conversation. Climate change isn't just melting ice caps, it's subtly altering the stresses on fault lines from Alaska to the Himalayas, creating seismic risks we're only beginning to map. Rising sea levels could amplify tsunamis, while increased rainfall might lubricate unstable slopes, triggering more landslides like the one that buried Yungay. Yet within these warnings lies an opportunity. Just as the Romans mixed volcanic ash into their concrete, we're pioneering carbon-negative building materials that strengthen structures while healing the atmosphere. The same AI predicting quakes from electromagnetic pulses could one day optimize evacuation routes in real time. What binds all these threads together is choice. Will we repeat the mistakes of Port Royal, building recklessly on unstable ground, or emulate the Minoans, whose storage jars held not just food but foresight? History's earthquakes have handed us a mosaic of lessons about humility, adaptation, and the unshakable human spirit that rebuilds even when the ground won't stay still. So as you go about your day, remember, the Earth story is still being written, and we're all its co-authors. Hit like if you found this journey through seismic history as eye-opening as we did. Subscribe to explore more hidden forces shaping our world, and drop a comment which earthquake's legacy surprised you most. The ground may tremble, but curiosity never rests.